Okay, so I'm Annette Vee. I'm at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm connecting, I guess. I mean, you guys did a good job of putting together this panel, I think. We're all doing something about code. Like Kevin, I'm interested in the connection of code to writing. But I'm making this connection along the lines of law. So in Crystal's schema, I was one of those people. I'm the only one talking about law, apparently, although I will mention the flash crash, which you guys, a couple people have mentioned something about that in the high stakes trading. So there's a lot of connections here. So I want to start out with a theoretical kind of scenario. I have a piece of software that I want to protect from being distributed in certain ways. So I want to control its circulation. So what do I do about that? What are my options? I have several different control regimes that I might use for it. So one, I might charge for it. It might be super expensive, which will both encourage pirating and also make me some money, perhaps. I could use copyright law, contract law in order to control its distribution. I could just shame people and say, please don't take my software. I could use some things in code, like obfuscating the code. I could install some other sort of thing on your computer that spies on everything else on your computer and do some interesting things there. And also physically, I could just not upload it online, in which case then you can't find it online, right? So these are a number of different kind of control regimes. You might recognize these as very similar to what Larry Lessig talks about as the 4 ways of regulating behavior. And this is in his book Code or Code 2.0. He talks about law, norms, market, and architecture. Now, he classifies computer code as architecture, but I want to split it out from his schema because I think it's very different. But I also really want to spend most of my time here in that talk, in the talk today. So Lessig argues that law can indirectly regulate the others, and moreover, this is a good thing. Legal regulation of online spaces and digital technology is good because we have a say in that, at least indirectly, through the political process. He's very nervous about the ways that code can be used to circumvent laws, for instance, eroding fair use of copyrighted materials or recording data on who reads what online. He's a lawyer, so of course it's perhaps unsurprising that his preference is for laws over computer code as a means of regulation. Rhetoricians, however, are in the same camp as Lessig. Rhetoric has been used to create change and generally influence law. So here's Lessig's vision. Law is influencing market, architecture, and norms. But we might say that rhetoric is influencing law, which is influencing market, architecture, and norms. Lessig argues that the law is the master regulator, and I think rhetoric is the master lever because of its role in constructing the law. The tools of rhetoric allow judges to construct reasoning in their decisions. They also allow us to analyze this reasoning. Rhetoric gets people in office. It also helps us understand why they're there, what they're saying, what it means. Rhetoric creates and interprets argument, audience, context, style, and hundreds of other aspects of politics and law. Through definitions and metaphors in the law, it draws boundaries around legal jurisdictions. Because rhetoric concerns what's up for negotiation, what's changeable and uncertain, rhetoric is baked into the process of lawmaking and legal interpretation. And I have a piece on this about the definition of code in the law, for instance, that I'm happy to talk about if anybody's interested. The application of rhetoric to computer code is a much more difficult question. Computers execute code. They follow orders exactly as they're told, and they're not subject to persuasion, although this is perhaps a controversial statement in this room. Ostensibly, at least, they don't operate in the realm of the probable, or as Jim, I think, is going to argue, the possible. Rhetoric and the law are both about the probable, and code is about the certain. So anxiously, Lessig asks this: where do we challenge the code? When the software protects without relying in the end on the state, where can we challenge the nature of the protection? Where can we demand balance when code takes it away? You can see his anxiety here, right? In essence, I think he's asking, what happens to rhetoric when code is law? What happens when we leave the spaces we can negotiate and change and enter a space where digital architecture determines our possibilities? So I want to explore this question through a few different angles. First, I'm going to give a few examples of the permeable borders between legal code and computer code, and then I'll show some ways that computer code is being used to bypass law and rhetoric. In all of these examples, Lessig's basic concept of the shifting regimes of control is at play. But I'm perhaps more sanguine than Lessig about the potential role for rhetoric when code takes over for law. Because rhetoric is about the possible and code is about the certain, rhetoric's role changes. But I think there's still room for it. Ultimately, I want to move beyond Lessig's anxiety to suggest that the intersections between legal and computer code open up new possibilities for rhetoric. So, code versus law in digital spaces. Lessig claims that law is the master regulator because it can be used to regulate norms, market, and architecture, including architecture in code. This might be theoretically true, but in the realm of the digital, the pace of the law is much, much slower than the pace of architecture, especially architecture in code. So until there are relevant laws or rulings made on specific situations, code-based architecture rules. So, for instance, high-frequency trading, right? If we could effectively regulate code-based high-frequency trading through the law, we would probably want to do that. It turns out it's a very difficult problem. But legal regulation of code isn't always a good thing. Lessig provides examples of places where the government regulations on code can indirectly curtail our rights as citizens. He's particularly concerned about regulations that require information about our online activity to be reportable to the government. If ISPs have to report our online activity to the government, even if only in emergency situations, it means they're going to have to collect that data in the first place, right? He's understandably nervous about situations like that because code is then tacitly taking away some of our rights to privacy. An example of the ways that code can be regulated by the government in a potentially good way, though, is net neutrality, which has also been referenced here today. Computer code determines the delivery of packets over the internet, and it can be written to prefer some packets over others. We all know this, right? And in the absence of regulation that prevented it, internet providers could employ code that sort of choked systems and could regulate markets in a way that we maybe didn't want, right? This is the code side of the net neutrality issue, but of course we can think of it from the legal and rhetorical side too. For instance, the campaign to brand the issue net neutrality in the first place, and John Oliver's influential show on it just recently. With these rhetorical interventions, the law has stepped in to regulate the circulation of bits online, preventing preferred packets. So both law and code can be used to determine the circulation of information online. And of course, there's 100 different ways to child porn or whatever, right? But in this instance, the law, at least at this stage, has won out. And most tech-savvy people concerned about rights online said, at least in this case, that's for the best. There are places where we might say that law and code are in a heated battle for precedence. These are these places, right? This happens in many different areas of the law. Contract, copyright, government regulations from the FCC and the SEC. The more places computer code goes, the more complicated is its relationship with the law. So here's one more example of the ways that law and computer code intersect, and where law is trumping code, and that's software license agreements. The slide, or the language in these license agreements essentially transforms the piece of software that you're using from software subject to copyright law to software subject to contract law. It performs this like magical rhetorical thing, which is one of the things that's awesome about studying the law, is that it can magically sort of make one thing into another thing through definition. So you might technically be able to circulate the code for a piece of software, but the license agreement defines the thing that you own as a license to use the software, not the software itself. So for instance, Blizzard sued a group of programmers who had created a server to play WoW somewhere other than on Blizzard's server, which was part of the license agreement. These programmers were found to be violating the license agreement under the DMCA, so Blizzard won their case. Software licensing agreements also, though, make possible open source software. Copyleft licenses work within the regime of legal copyright and licensing to restrict the distribution and uses of code beyond the user's first transaction. Through licensing rather than transfer of ownership, open source software is able to circumvent the limitations placed on copyright holders through the first sale doctrine. So the right of first sale, for instance, allows you to sell your books on Amazon that are used, et cetera. You can't sell the content of your book, but you can sell the physical book. But on the other hand, if you download Firefox, you simply have a license to use it. You don't have the right of first sale to resell it. Open source licensing operates in just the same way as most commercial software licensing. It just gives users different restrictions on what they can do with software after they've downloaded it. But this is what licensing allows them to do, is sort of continue control after sale. Open source software provides an important example of the complicated trade-offs and intersections between law, code, and I would say rhetoric. Through these alternative methods of software distribution, open source software performs an end run around rhetoric. So Richard Stallman's arguments about the need for him to have access to the code on his printer in the mid-1980s were unsuccessful. He wasn't able to get this code. So instead, he went a different route. He wrote and programmed free software. Code and novel uses of the law meant that he could bypass rhetoric and create and distribute code the way he wanted to. So far, we've looked at a few ways that legal code and computer code interact, either pushing it in new spaces or bypassing it altogether. The relationships between legal and computer code in these examples are indirect. Now I want to look at an example of a direct relationship between code and the law. So this is a group that is substituting code for the law, in essence, attempting to directly replace rhetoric with code. So this is a group called Common Accord. And Common Accord seeks to make boilerplate contracts into codable templates. It's designing legal documents that are executable in code rather than just in the minds of lawyers. We might think of lawyers as being able to execute law, right? They know how it works, they know how it functions, they can sort of run the programs in their head and tell you, yeah, you can do that, no, you can't do that. Common Accord's founder, Jim Hazard, is a lawyer, and he claims that in their legal forms, lawyers essentially work with compiled code rather than source code. This makes legal documents harder to read, and it means that a lot of work is reproduced. Lawyers routinely copy and paste across legal documents, but Common Accord offers a different way of avoiding reproducing work. And I'm actually thinking about Kevin's diagram with CAPTCHA and the sort of trees here, that it might be this kind of shift that Common Accord is looking for. Common Accord operates with an object model where legal documents are objects. Children of those objects, that is to say documents based off the original, can inherit particular traits of it and clearly convey the ways they differ from the original. Common Accord borrows the affordances of object-oriented code and applies them to legal documents. So here's their description of what they do. This is their solution after describing that problem. A simple data model for the creation of a digital law commons. We have created a modular template system of text cards that relies on expansion of strings and expansion of cards, period. People can program their relationships. Lawyers can codify boilerplates. Management can have a data picture of the enterprise's relationships, situations, and activities. Smart contracts can be both technical dry code and legal wet code. With Common Accord, contract and legal text becomes cards of text interoperating in Git, shared, forked, tested, and improved. So here are some of the legal documents that they offer online. They offer patient consent forms that inherit clauses. They offer privacy policies that show diffs. They have this sort of copyright licenses through Creative Commons, working as source code where you can fork them, et cetera. And because of the forking, you can sort of trace where the diffs are and what they're taking, what they're not taking from previous versions. So they call all these legal documents smart contracts. And here's their example explanation of what smart contracts are. Smart contracts eliminate the need for trust amongst the parties, who can be sure that the contract will be performed exactly as agreed. Indeed, as opposed to traditional legal contracts, smart contracts are always and necessarily deterministic, i.e., all possible outcomes of the contract, including penalties for breach of contract, must be explicitly stipulated in advance. So Common Accord's, interestingly, Common Accord's tagline is a world without paperwork. But I think they're not looking for a world without paperwork because they don't propose to do away with legal documentation after all. They're looking for a world without rhetoric. No trust needed, no negotiation or shades of interpretation, nothing probable or possible, everything certain, deterministic, as they say here. And indeed, contract law aspires to be deterministic, at least in situations of good faith. That means that the clearer the terms are, the better. We can see these values evidenced in the explanation of these smart contracts. But as deterministic as the smart contracts claim to be, of course, they still have to be designed and implemented in situations of probability. And that's where rhetoric enters. Common Accord is a fascinating approach to translating the law into code, but it doesn't escape rhetoric as much as it looks like it wants to do so. So at this point, let me attempt a kind of synthesis about where these intersections between computer code and legal code are and what they mean for rhetoric. So here's my TLDR. When legal code and computer code run into each other, rhetoric gets pushed around. So first, I want to return to an assertion that I made at the beginning of this talk, and that is that rhetoric and the law are both about the probable, and code is about the certain. And again, this might be a debatable assertion. But it's not at all clear that probability is better than certainty, or vice versa, which means that in considering the trade-offs between rhetoric and code, or between law and code, rhetoric is still required. Rhetoric is still this master lever. Rhetoric can be employed in our decisions about when and how to use code, whether it should be changeable or accessible or permanent and inaccessible. And here we can go back to open source software. Open source software operates with the paradigm of transparency and changeability. Each individual routine in the code might be certain. But the fact that it can be forked and changed means that it's inherently rhetorical. Code that is distributed in an opaque and compiled format is certain because it's not changeable, except through the traditional means of changing architecture through rhetoric. So protests, letters, city council meetings, etc. This is how we change rhetoric, or how we change architecture through rhetoric. We don't argue with the buildings themselves because arguing with architecture would be dumb, right? Instead, we can use rhetoric as a lever during the construction of the building, or we can use rhetoric as a lever during the construction of computer code. Lessig is concerned about code supplanting law in part because code can be used as architecture that tacitly operates in the background, determining our paths in ways that we aren't aware of. For instance, collecting data we didn't know we were sharing or violating our rights to privacy. Code may always be certain, but that doesn't mean that everyone knows that certainty. It doesn't mean that we all have access to that certainty. Making code's architecture transparent, even if it's not subject to change, is a job for rhetoric. And if code is subject to change, the ability to change that code can afford many of the possibilities we generally ascribe to rhetoric. We can change code directly through modding programs on our personal computers and networks, or we can fork versions of open source software, or we can make new versions of programs that suit our needs. And whether we can do those things depends a lot on how code gets regulated in the law. For instance, government rules on encryption and data storage, and how code is defined through copyright and patent law. So at this point, I want to return to our original question here. What happens to rhetoric when code is law? I think that it displaces rhetoric from the position of interpretation. Computers do the interpreting. But through this displacement, rhetoric's other roles grow more important. In shared spaces, we must consider how code should be employed, where and for what audiences and purposes, and what degree of transparency or access should be associated with it. Should legal code or computer code be used, for instance, to regulate spam in email or high-frequency trading? Should we use code-based automated plagiarism detection tools or not? And when we can change code, should we? Should we fork versions, or should we make our own app instead of pressing for change in existing code? Rhetoric is a lever to change law, but if code is law, we can use rhetoric to change code in its construction stage. Or we can change code directly by writing it again. In this way, we can think of the writing of code as a performance of rhetoric. Code gives us new affordances and shifts the calculations between the means we have to regulate behavior. And since we as rhetoricians are interested in affordances, we should be thinking of code as a new, though perhaps complicated space for digital rhetoric.